Jacinta, thank you for joining us. Now, you've been described as you are an author, a facilitator, a teacher, an educator, a communicator. But for those that might not know you, why don't you maybe introduce us to who you are and what you do?
Well, my name is Jacinta Kitt, and I'm first and foremost a teacher. I have been involved in education for close on, I wouldn't like to say how many years, but over 30 years at every level. I was teaching at primary level, that's first level for children from the age of 5 to 12. Subsequently, I taught and still do at third level, but I'm involved with schools, I'm involved with teachers, I'm involved with principals of schools, and the area that I'm mainly concerned with is the environment in schools and how it affects the quality of service being provided to children. That's my main area of research and my main area in terms of my work.
Okay, fantastic. Well, that's certainly a large body of work for sure. And I guess in the context of ANUA and what ANUA is doing and the programs that ANUA is rolling out, I guess just to touch on from your own experience, how would you describe the education system or even the environment of education as a whole as it stands in Ireland right now?
Well, it's considered to be very, very high. The standard of education is considered to be very high. We have really dedicated teachers in our schools. However, there is always room for improvement in every education system. And from my perspective, whereas we have amazingly talented and dedicated and committed teachers, we always need to look at the environment in which they work. I mean, what is their workplace like? What is the quality of their workplace? Because of the impact of that on the service they provide to the children. So, very good, but always room for improvement, like everything else.
Like everything else is right. So, how does one measure something like that?
Yeah, very difficult in terms of the work environment, because for me at this stage, I've been so long visiting schools, and I visited hundreds of schools, if not thousands of schools. For me, it's almost like a sense that I get when I walk in the door, a sense of whether I feel comfortable just as a visitor or whether I feel anxious and a bit stressed. And I think that was what really interested me in the subject first, because I had cause to visit schools. I was working with student teachers, supervising them when they were out preparing to be teachers and doing their teaching practice. So I had cause to visit up to maybe 10 schools in the day. And I began to notice that each school had a very individual sense when you walked into it, is all I could. I used to actually say it's kind of a smell, but of course it wasn't a smell, but it was something that struck you when you walked into the school. And then I began to wonder why there were such distinctive senses or vibes coming from schools when you went in as a visitor. And when I began to investigate it, I mean, it was pretty obvious. It was down to the people in the school, how they worked with each other, how they related to each other, how they got on with each other, what sort of relationships they had with each other, and that created the vibe. But even on a very short visit to a school, I could ascertain the impact of that vibe, perhaps on the atmosphere in the staff room when you went in. In a good one, you'd find a bit of banter, informality. In a one that hadn't got such a good sense, there might be a hierarchy of mugs and chairs, and you dare and take the wrong mug or sit in the wrong chair. And 5 minutes in a staff room like that seemed like an hour. And you'd also see it on the faces of the children. Children in schools that have a good vibe are more content in themselves, they're more at ease with themselves. So that is where I started this work, sensing the different environments in school, ascertaining where it came from, and then beginning to work on what were the elements that need to be worked on to improve school environments.
Very good. And I'm wondering, can you paint us a picture as to what a positive atmosphere in a school looks like or feels like? Can you?
Well, to be honest, it really is down to the levels of positivity of the individuals who work there. And once it was considered very important, if you went to take a job in a school in terms of your interview, the thing that was considered most important was your CV, what sort of qualifications you had. But now it's increasingly being recognised recognised that the most important thing is the disposition of the people who are going to work with children, in terms of them having primarily a positive disposition. So you'll notice it in terms of levels of positivity. They aren't that easy to ascertain because you just take them for granted, but you sure as hell can notice if there are levels of negativity. And it can be as few as one person who doesn't even have to come in. They only have to park their car in the car park and the negativity can shoot ahead of them. So it is really important that we have a majority of teachers who work in the school who have a prevailing positive attitude. And it is also important that we endorse that, we empower that, but equally important that we address the minority of negative teachers who can really affect the atmosphere in the school for their colleagues and of course for their students.
Yeah, it's interesting even as a parent to think how any child or my child's education, mood and entire experience in the school can be affected in that way by a teacher or a number of teachers. And I'm wondering, how does it might be a very obvious question or an obvious answer, but can you explain to me what is that pathway where the negativity transfers from whether it's a situation or a teacher through to the child, and what kind of impact can that have?
Well, I mean, negativity, I suppose, indicates the quality of the relationship that's going to be between the teacher and the child. So if the teacher is negative, for example, they may have a tendency to be angry or cross, or they may have a tendency to, pick on children or to single them out for punishment or, things like that. It can affect the entire relationship between the adult and the child. They may also be a little bit intolerant of children who do not behave very well and maybe assign them to some sort of naughty chairs or bowl table or practices like that are associated with negative thinking that are really considered to be unhelpful in terms of managing children. They may also show favoritism to children, where they have favorites, maybe the ones who are more equipped academically or whatever, and other children can feel left out. They can also maybe promote competitive environments where you have student of the week, student of the year, student of the month. And I mean, those sort of practices need to be questioned in terms of their viability, because effectively you create one winner and everybody else is a loser. So those the negativity manifests itself like that with the children. With the staff, negativity manifests itself in an unwillingness to try new things, to maintain the status quo, to say, oh, we tried that back in 1999, didn't work then, won't work now. So they stifle the positivity of others. Negativity in itself is bad enough, and it can be contagious, but it does something else. It actually disempowers positivity, because very negative people don't actually like positive people. So they are inclined to put down the positivity. So it's really important that that kind of negativity is considered to be exceptional. Okay. And is addressed when it does happen. It has a myriad of effects all across the board.
Okay, and I find that fascinating, and I think there are some kind of key challenges in there. And on one side you've got the challenges with the teachers and making sure that they are, I guess, equipped or trained or at least aware enough to be able to manage themselves properly. And then on the other side you have the students. And I guess in the context of what Anu is doing in terms of trying to create a program that addresses both. Things like competitiveness in school. Some would say, well, that's a good thing, and to be honest, I don't see that as a bad thing. But I from what you're saying, I don't know whether I don't think that you're saying it's either positive or negative. That it just needs to be managed, and I guess it's an element of balance. So can you maybe just explain that a bit more?
Well, people need to ask themselves, why would we do it? Why would we, at the end of the week, bring the children together and pick a winner? I mean, how would the teachers feel, for example, if they were brought together at the end of the week and a winner was picked? They would be very disgruntled, the ones who didn't win. So it's not a motivation. Only about 10% of children are motivated by competition, and they're only motivated to win the prize. But what our job is as educators is to motivate everybody. So that means giving recognition to achievements as they are achieved. So the small, because for some children are never going to hit the lofty heights that others are going to hit. But for example, a small child who never finished an exercise and comes in one day with their exercise finished, that is really important to say to them, fair play to you, good man, look at what you've done, keep that up, you can go anywhere. You know, it's really important, and that gives them the motivation to continue. What motivation is in the fact that they might never get the prize? You know, that discourages them. So it's not throwing baby out with the bathwater, never giving an award, never celebrating success. It's not about that. It's about using it as as the main motivational factor when it has as many disadvantages as it has advantages. I would say maybe a lot more. But I've done a lot of work on it and a lot of research on it, and I suppose I'm very firm in my views. But I don't say to people, throw it out entirely. And people do say to me as well, but sure, they need to be competitive. Life is competitive. Yes, life is very competitive, but how do we prepare them for it? We prepare them for it by developing them as individuals, not telling them they're losers in school. We develop them, we praise them, we encourage them, we allow them to reach their potential in their own right, realistic expectations of their abilities, and letting them achieve those. That doesn't mean that we stop them at any, you know, there's no threshold, but we praise them for what they do individually. And cooperative learning is a methodology for teaching, which is also really, really advised, where children work together and help each other. So some of the ones that might be more equipped academically reinforce the messages for those who might be less able to understand a concept. Some parents will complain about that. Oh, I want my child gushing ahead. I don't want my child helping the weaker ones, they might call them in inverted commas. But 96%, there is 96 learning in reinforcing, and reinforcing when they're teaching somebody else, where there's such small percentages from seeing and hearing and reading. So, you know, the cooperative learning methodology is considered to be the very, very advanced and, you know, very sophisticated and very simple at the same time. And to me, it's more reflective of us as human beings. We are a collaborative species. We work best together. Rather than alone.
So would it be fair if I was to try to boil that down to something as simple as develop them individually and reward them collaboratively? Would that fall
well,
into...
there can be collaborative rewards in terms of groups within the cooperative learning system, but I'd say reward them individually, yes, but individually in relation to what they have achieved, rather than file save as to pick the best out of the lot. It's been abandoned as a methodology for more. I mean,
well, has it ever been an actual methodology though? Because I mean, I think if you want to go right back to the education system, it's always been based on like that. It's standardized testing. It's everything is done is you fit. Children are meant to fit a certain quota, whether it's by age. It is primarily by age, and nothing really else. So how do you begin to redefine the structures? That I mean, isn't that a massive a task?
It is a big job, yes, of course. And I mean, changing the whole system of education is a very big job indeed. But changing the focus to ensure that children can cope even within the system is something we can do, without having the advantage of having changes of legislation or changes at the highest level in departments of education.
So could you maybe give us a couple of examples, and again, on the very most simplest level, as to what do you think contributes to like positive well-being in school, in any school, or what are the small things that parents, teachers, or even students themselves can do
to instill in children a belief in themselves is probably the first and foremost thing. A sense of hope. Teachers who are high in hope, they have a variety of methodologies for doing that, but they do help students to set targets for themselves. Then they motivate them to achieve those targets. And once the students have mastery of a target, whatever it is, or a goal, then that sets off a cycle of motivation, where you really don't have to do much motivating. It comes from it's internal, intrinsic motivation. That's very important. But the most important thing of all is the way we speak to them, the way we talk to them, how we communicate with them, what sort of relationships we have with them. And the relationships that should be between teachers and students are democratic, that the rights of both are equally respected. You know, that wasn't always the case. There used to be, and there is still in some schools, a hierarchy of importance between teachers and students. The teachers are not more important than students. They do have authority, of course, and rightly so, but they're not more important. The authority doesn't give them permission to talk down to children, to humiliate them, to embarrass them, or do anything. They're much more aware of that now. The young teachers coming out in Ireland, much more aware of the relationships that they have with children and how precious the children are. And the children are their first and foremost focus, not themselves. But traditionally it wasn't like that. Traditionally it was a controlling. Teachers were, you know, could have been very controlling. Punitive measures used. Now we advise against that. Managing behaviour appropriately. You know, managing your own emotions. The teachers managing anger, you know, upset that they can feel, frustration, being able to manage it and being able to pause and think and be able to think, well, what's the best situation here for the relationship between me and this child? And it's always in a conflict situation, win-win. But traditionally it used to be win-lose. You know, the child had to lose. You know, how dare you speak to the teacher like that? You know, down you go to the principal's office and, you know, humiliate them and whatever. That didn't happen. There were always amazing teachers who didn't use that kind of behaviour, but there were some who did. And it was more acceptable. Now we have to make it patently clear in the policies that we have in schools, in the ethos that we have in schools, that that kind of behaviour is not acceptable. Shouting at kids is not acceptable, you know. So it's gradual changes, how we speak to them, how we treat them, how we get them to engage if they're not engaging. That we look to ourselves as professionals and we say, well, what could we be doing differently to engage a greater number of students here? You know, and that means looking at yourself, self-awareness. You know, we call it in the educational system reflective practice. You know, there are loads of wonderful definitions of that, including Socrates' one was an unexamined life isn't worth living. Not to be outdone by Socrates, I wrote my own one night, and I suggest that reflective practice is 2 steps of doing and 1 step of stopping and saying, how am I doing? So introspecting, asking. Sometimes you have to ask someone else if your level of awareness is not that high. You have to say to someone else, look, I had a major problem with a student this morning. This is what happened. What do you think? You know, how do you think I handled it? And being able to listen. So there are a whole range of dimensions to it, from the physical dimension, from the communication dimension, from the emotional dimension, the psychological dimension, recognizing how powerful we are as teachers. It's one of the most powerful and influential jobs in the world. We can mold society. For the better or for the worse.
Well, I think education really is the foundation for I think personally for society, and I think it's also an incredibly unique opportunity to, like you just said, to help to mold our future generations. Because what other opportunity you have. Now, you did touch on something which you've actually written about in terms of your book, Positive Behaviours and Relationships and Emotions, specifically on the emotional element. Again, it sounds like a very obvious question, but how important are the emotional dimensions between teachers and children, and how can that be better managed?
Hugely important. But I mean, the first thing is the recognition that, you know, people are actually feeling something when they are angry or upset. I mean, I talked to a group of principals about 2 years ago when I dared to mention emotions in terms of leadership in schools. Not that many of them weren't totally tuned in, but there were always a few who weren't. And one particular person said to me, well, I deal with the emotions of my staff very simply, he said. I tell them not to be bringing their emotions into school. There's no space in school for emotions. Leave your emotions at home. Well, that to me said it all. That to me said it all in terms of the lack of awareness about emotions, because chance would be a fine thing if you could leave them at home, but they're with you. They hit you. You can't stop them hitting you. So if a child does something that upsets you, if you're frustrated over something, if you're angry over something, you can't stop the emotion hitting you. That's a fact. But you can do an awful lot about it once it hits you. You can learn how to, if it is a negative emotion, to diminish it. You know, to down-regulate it, as they say, which you have to do as a professional with children. Or if it's a positive one, alternatively, you can learn how to upregulate it and hold on to it and let it spread out into the class. So it's emotional intelligence is quite simply about recognising that emotionals, we have them, we all have them, male and female. It used to be thought that males didn't have them at all. You know, oh no, you'd want us going around crying all over the place. Nothing to do with crying. It's to do with how the feelings, the emotions that hit you when things happen. But the emotional intelligence is about managing them. And it is vitally important that we create a positive emotional climate in the classroom for children to be able to recognise their emotions. In other countries, they do an awful lot on the self-science, which is learning about yourself. And they say you shouldn't learn about any other, you shouldn't be involved in any other science until you learn the science of self. But we don't do it to the same extent in Ireland, but it is incorporated into other elements of the curriculum. But there needs to be much more emphasis on it from the point of view of the teacher's emotions in terms of managing, and it is one of the most emotional jobs of all, emotionally intense. If you're a teacher, you're there all day, you're stuck, you can't get out the door. So if you feel anger, you have to deal with it. You can't just leave the class and go off down, put your feet up in the staff room. You have to manage that emotion in there. In other jobs, you can get out for a while. You can make a phone call home, you can go for a walk and have lunch with a friend. Schools, no, you're there all day. So really intense and emotionally intense as well. So from that perspective, it is vitally important that teachers have emotional intelligence. And of course the example is the best way to teach anything to children. They practice, so that they practice what they preach and the children practice what they see. So it's emulating what they see in terms of kindness and caring and patience, things we always associated with teachers and that the good teachers always had. But it can be lacking in others. So it's to make that the prevailing way that children are treated in schools. A lot of places talk about excellent schools. If you're watching the property programs in England, location, next to an excellent school. And I always say, what is an excellent school? Is an excellent school, in some people's eyes, it's where they'll be mixing with like-minded people who earn the same amount of money and drive the same calibre of car and are in the same right golf club. That's what, for some people, what it is. And other people, academic, purely academic. But success in life, emotional intelligence, according to Goldman, 4 times more important than IQ for success in life. So it's not diminishing IQ. Of course it's getting people to reach their potential, but to getting them to value the diversity of other students. So it's a whole, maybe, not even a whole rethink, because it's happening anyway, but a whole focus.
It's a refocusing, rebalancing,
rebalancing, back to what it should be.
So it's interesting. I'd like to put it back just for a second, because we've talked a lot about, I guess, the system and I guess your views on it, which personally I would agree entirely with. I'm curious as well for myself and for anybody watching. We know what you do, and I guess your experience, your knowledge speaks for itself. But I'd love to hear a bit about what you're obviously very passionate about this. I'd love to maybe get an insight into kind of what brought you to this and how this became such a focus for you in your life.
Well, I was a teacher myself. Didn't always get it right, but basically, I feel that as a teacher, I always created an informal environment for kids, because they're much happier in informal environments. But a lot of the environments in schools when I started teaching, which isn't today or yesterday, were very formal, rigid. They were silent. They had their fingers on their lips. They didn't talk. They weren't allowed to talk. And they walked in straight lines, the fingers to their lips. And I never really was comfortable with that. I thought, I remember teaching next to a fellow who had 6 class boys. They were about 11 years of age, sitting with their fingers on their lips all day. And I remember we were expected to have them quiet. That was the expectation of teachers. I was a new teacher at the time. I used to say to my lads next door, shh, he'll hear you. I was afraid of him myself, actually. But, you know, I asked him once, how did he get them so quiet? Because I thought I better get a bit of that quietness or I won't pass here my diploma to become fully fledged teacher after college. And he said, it's as simple as this, Jacinta. I could go off to Majorca for a week on my holidays and I could leave them lads sitting there and they'd be still sitting with their fingers on their lips when I came back. Brilliant lesson for me. Fear, control. Any collegiate could do that, I said to myself. I don't want to be that teacher. I don't want to leave my lads sitting there and go off and have them sitting there when I came back. Fear, control. A lot of teachers went out the door and went down to do a bit of photocopying, leaving the door open for everyone to hear the silence. Am I great? I can provoke silence. Anybody can do that. But the wonderful teachers who have them working like ants, all engaged in elements of the lesson that you're doing and chatting to each other and whatever. And when they're busy and when they're interested, they don't shout and roar. And you can always say, quiet now, mice, mice. I used to say mice. Oh, we have to go like mice. You know, and they do it, they love it. And they don't feel the time passing, they don't get bored, and there is cooperation and there is learning and all of that. So I suppose my own initial experiences of it, and it's always been with me. I'm not saying I always got it right, but I always had a sense of having a bit of fun, spontaneity in terms of myself. You know, for example, beautiful sunny day. You wouldn't want to be doing it now, you'd have them out every day. But we have a heat wave at the moment while this is being recorded. Probably be raining when somebody sees it. But, you know, sunny day, and you're just about to start a lesson, an intense lesson, and you say, right, pencils down, we're going for a walk in the park. And, you know, a little bit of spontaneity. You incorporated it into your curriculum down the line a bit. But, you know, a bit of spontaneity, they love that. They love a bit of fun. You know, if you make a mistake on the blackboard, you know, and somebody says, teacher, you spelt whatever, Anua wrong. Well, we could all spell that one wrong. We spelled something wrong. You've spelled something wrong. Instead of saying, oh yes, I'm glad you spotted it. I put it up there now to see would anyone spot it. Instead of saying that, you say, oh right, there you are now. Teacher's not that good at her spellings. Look at what that does to the child who's not good at the spelling. I'm not so bad. Teacher's bad too at the spellings. So it was a whole array of things that got me into that frame. And then I suppose I did actually start my research for my master's thesis was workplace bullying in primary schools. But you can't keep talking about bullying. It's very depressing. So I started to look at kind of almost prevention, you know, preventative measures to create an environment where bullying wouldn't be tolerated. So if there's high levels of positivity, there's less inclination to have inappropriate behaviours. And that filters down to the children as well. You know, I mean, bullying among children is quite prevalent. But if the staff aren't getting on with each other and if the staff aren't treating each other well, the message that the kids get is, it's okay to bully here. So it's linked, the linkages to all of the subjects that I'm interested in. And really it's the interpersonal, it's the psychological. That's what I'm interested in. I'm not a psychologist, I'm a teacher, basically. But I suppose that's my background in it.
And I guess, you know, we're kind of, now when you touch on depression, we're not going to talk about depression, but I guess it is kind of the elephant in the room, I guess, in a sense, because that is a consequence of bad management in schools or negativity in schools when it's not addressed, or even worse off if it's not even acknowledged. And I guess in regards to Anua, I guess their focus is targeting the mental health of children ultimately, and creating, make it positive, you know, creating a positive mental well-being within schools. So again, do a separate set of rules apply for that, or how could you maybe summarize, I guess, what we're talking about into how that can actually be delivered through programs that Anua is doing?
Yeah, well, it's not separate, it's totally integrated. I mean, well-being is multi-dimensional, it's multifaceted. It's almost flavour of the month now that everybody is talking about it. And a lot of people have different notions of what it is. But basically, it's children feeling okay about themselves, feeling happy in themselves, not all the time, we're all going to have bad days, but feeling content with themselves, having high high self-esteem, having a sense of self-worth, valuing themselves. And that comes from one thing and one thing only, their relationships with the others. So it's the quality of the relationships that impacts on the well-being of the children. And as I said, for example, is to indicate to a child that irrespective of how good or bad they are in the academic areas or the sporting arena or whatever, that they are in themselves valued, to send that message to them. So through caring for them, through how we speak to them, I think I'm repeating myself really now in saying that. So what I'm saying is that the things I've been talking about are the kernel elements of promoting well-being among children. So it's all about the relationships, it's all about the environment, it's all about how they feel coming in the morning and how they feel going home in the evening. It's about treating them as individuals. It's about a greater association between school and happiness and enjoyment. That's number one. Then treating them as individuals, because they are individuals, instead of collectively bringing them together, as we said, you know, to indicate that there's a level playing pitch for prizes. There isn't a level playing pitch. They're coming from different backgrounds, different levels of ability, all of that. So treating them as individuals, managing poor behaviour. I mean, if they behave inappropriately, managing that in a correct way, in a constructive way. You know, separate, and the two philosophies that are there as long as teaching is going on is separate the behaviour from the child. The behaviour is unacceptable, the child is not bad.
Yes.
So, you know, come up here, you bold thing. No, they can't hear anything about their behaviour now. They've labelled them. So it's not labelling children. And the other philosophy was always catch them being good. It's awful easy to catch them being bad. You know, you sneak out the door and you double back in and somebody is immediately up waving something or throwing a paper arrow across the room. Gotcha. You know, it's catching them being bad. But catch them being good. And sometimes for some of them it's hard because they do misbehave. But you have to go with your Geiger counter until you catch them doing something good. And then focus on that. And that enables them to get that sense of them being genuinely valued for something. So it's a whole, the caring environment, a sense of being caring. One of the worst feelings that you can give a child in school is a feeling that you don't like them. And they get it. At 5 years of age, they know, teacher doesn't like me. You know, and can you imagine that feeling of going in every day, maybe coming from a home where they are liked and loved and treasured, and they come into a class with a sense of not being liked. So, you know, it's reminding teachers of their responsibilities in relation to their professionalism, which is very much about their behaviour. So it's linking behaviour to performance, to professionionalism, you know, rather than thinking of it as an optional extra.
Well, look, I could feel like I could talk to you all day, and it's quite fascinating. But before you wrap up, though, I'd like to get a sense from you, or maybe even a testimonial, I guess, if you'd like, or your thoughts on what ANUA is trying to achieve. How would you, with your background, your experience, and your knowledge, describe? And just generally speaking, you know, what do you think of what they're trying to do?
Well, I suppose I was asked to help out in the guise of my own work. So I suppose it's reinforcing the message. For me, it would be getting an opportunity to reinforce the messages that we've just articulated there. How important the environment is in a school for children. How important it is in the home as well. I do a lot of work with parents. So there may be an opportunity to talk to parents around what sort of an environment in the home is conducive to children feeling good about themselves and feeling accepted and thriving, and all of those things that are the things that you'll find under the wellbeing portfolio or the wellbeing mantle. And I think, you know, to be able to get across you say it's my passion, it is my passion, get across the things that are very passionate to me and to maybe make a difference to somewhere, to someone. That's probably as simple as that.
In the end, Well, listen, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.